My name is Julia Steinberger. I'm a professor of ecological economics and social ecology at the University of Leeds. I'm also a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a big body of scientific, not a big body, like a large number of scientists who try to sort of assess the status of the science. And that's part of the reason that I'm here to talk to you. We're going to try to go fast, but we're going to try to not be horribly confusing. So good luck to us. All right, are we ready? So the first thing I wanted to talk about is whether or not there has been warming. So we're talking about climate change, we're talking about global warming. Has there been warming? And compared to what? What are we talking about? Like, if you measure your own temperature to see if you have a fever, you have to know what you're comparing it to, what's normal. And so that's your first plot. We have them printed out a bit bigger here. You still can't see them, but you can see them on your handout. And basically, what this plot shows is it shows you two things. It shows you 0 on this plot. Over here is that black line, black and gray line. And 0 corresponds to the temperature, the average temperature of the planet before the industrial age. So before we started burning lots of coal, burning lots of oil and petrol, and putting lots of carbon dioxide and other warming gases in the atmosphere. So 0 is something that we know about and can measure, and you might have asked questions about that. How well can we measure it? And what this plot shows you, it's a plot from the special report on 1.5 degrees of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what it shows you is it shows that we've measured the temperature increasing. So you might see where we are now, which is 2020, which is sort of on the green part of this. And what it shows you is that we've already warmed. So you can see us sort of leaving this black area in 1900 and then going up, and that we've now left this pink area. We're now at a warming already that we can already measure, and you see extremely clearly in the data, of about 1 degree above this normal 0 of the pre-industrial era. And that pink zone in the plot corresponds to the band of temperature, which is a very important band, not just for us, for our entire species, because our species developed things that are important in that narrow temperature band. That narrow temperature band is the narrow temperature that we have been in since the last ice age. So since in the whole Holocene, the last 12,000 or so years, we've been in that pink temperature zone, and we have now left it. And that means that we've already moved the Earth through global warming, through climate change, into a temperature that it has not seen since we developed agriculture. And that, for instance, our agriculture might not be adapted to, which is worrying since we depend on it for our food, which is important to us. You are still following me. Where are we headed in terms of temperature? This is a plot that Paul prepared for you, and it shows that we are headed for temperatures that can be in a different range, but we are headed for, at a very minimum, around 1.5, 1.7 degrees. That's if we stop emitting pretty much now. If we keep emitting according to our current so the commitments of the Paris Agreement, the UK is committed to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement says stay below 2 degrees, hopefully reach 1.5 degrees. Yes?
The Paris Agreement?
Paris Agreement is an international agreement that lots of countries, including the United Kingdom, signed in Paris in 2015. And so this agreement is internationally binding. And even though it has various issues with it, but it is internationally binding. So the UK, along with most other countries in the world, have committed to keep warming below 2 degrees. Now the problem by the end of the century, until the end of the century, the problem with that is that no country's policies currently really commit to that. Most countries' policies, if they continue as they do now, will lead us upwards of 3 degrees. And I will now turn it off.
Okay, hi everybody. So I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. My name's Paul Young. I'm a lecturer here at Lancaster University in the Environment Centre. I'm an atmospheric scientist, climate scientist, call me what you will. Okay, so the next bit we wanted to tell you what is the reality, and that's what Julia's told you about, and potentially where we're heading. Let's just I want to say a little bit about why is the climate changing. And of course we've had some allusions to this, and I think you all know the answer is due to greenhouse gases. So why do greenhouse gases warm the atmosphere? So one way you can think about it is is that we have this layer, this blanket around the Earth, like putting on a jumper, I suppose. And as we increase the amount of greenhouse gases, we're putting on more and more layers around the Earth, and we are therefore warming up. That's a very basic, very quick description, but that is pretty much the reality of how greenhouse gases are working. Now, what are the important greenhouse gases? If you look at it on the next picture you've got here, it's these three plots. So there are actually quite a range of greenhouse gases. The most important one in terms of climate change coming from humans is carbon dioxide. And I've also shown here, there are some pictures of methane, which is another very important greenhouse gas, and nitrous oxide, N2O, which is actually laughing gas, but no laughing matter. Okay, so these pictures here, these are real measurements taken from various places all around the world that have all been put together to show you how these gases are increasing. I'm sorry that they're over different amounts of time. The amount from carbon dioxide is coming from 1960 through to the present day, methane from 1980 through to the present day, and nitrous oxide, N2O, from about 2000 to the present day. You can all see they all share this same feature, that they're all going upwards. We also have an estimate of what these gases, what their levels were in the atmosphere, if you like, the thickness of that blanket around the Earth in the pre-industrial time, and they've all gone up massively. Carbon dioxide has gone up about 60%, methane has more than doubled, and nitrous oxide has gone up about 30%. And they all come from different sources, and I'll say something about that in a second. In fact, actually, one other thing I wanted to say is how long these gases last in the atmosphere. So methane will last tens of years, nitrous oxide will last 100 or so years. Carbon dioxide will, well, for very complicated reasons, which we can go in afterwards if you like, but will last there for thousands of years, really. So we're committing ourselves, every time we're putting something up into the atmosphere, we're committing ourselves to the composition of the atmosphere, what's in the atmosphere changing for a very long time. And the amount of warming that we get will be proportional to the amounts of these gases which are in the atmosphere. Now, we can say something about the emissions that are coming from the UK, and Julia's prepared a small presentation. I need to refer to my crib sheet here. So this is the amount of emissions of greenhouse gases coming from the UK from different types of sources. And we want to sort of illustrate how much they are through here. Now, each one of these Duplo blocks is, do you want to say?
It's 10 megatons of carbon dioxide. So a megaton is 1 million tons. So each block corresponds to, this is very scientific, 10 million tons of carbon dioxide and equivalent. So it includes the other greenhouse gases as well. And the UK emits roughly 450, so these are 45 blocks total, and I will now stack them.
You're going to stack them, so I'll talk through. So the first one is from transport, and that's 28% of our total emissions in the UK. Secondly, in red, we have our energy supply, which is about 23%. Then, we've even got the labels on there too, I didn't see that. Thank you, Julia. And then we have from industry, this is blue, this is 20%. And then we have residential, which is in brown, 17%. So coming from everything coming into our homes. Light green is agriculture.
So it's like the label is covering it, sadly. So it's the blue label, that's agriculture.
And that's about 8%. So agriculture, I didn't mention this before, so nitrous oxide, that's one of its main sources, is from agriculture. It comes from the fertilizers that we apply to our soils. And lastly, we have here 5% of our emissions are coming from waste.
That's landfill.
And landfill, things like that. Thank you. So there we have it. That's about 450 megatons of greenhouse gases that come from the UK and from all the different sources. Now, if you were to look at different countries around the world, you'll see they'd have different makeups, there'd be different numbers, and we'll say something about that a bit later. Okay, so I'm going to say something a little bit about the impacts of climate change. So I'll start actually on this one, if I may, just quickly, Julia, sorry. So this is a figure here. What I wanted to say is, we talk about 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming. That's a global average, okay? And this figure will just show you that the warming is not the same in different places of the world, nor is it the same in different amounts of time. You can see the deeper red color shows where places are warming quite a lot. So I haven't got time to go into this in a lot of detail, but just to really point out that, and this probably jumps out at you, in the Northern Hemisphere winter, the Arctic is warming at a rate about 3 times faster than the world is. This is from observations. This is an observationally based estimate. This is what's happening now. Okay, but now if we think about what's going to happen going into the future, these are this nice image here from the World Resources Institute, and I would encourage you to have a look at this, perhaps as part of your discussions that you'll have. This talks about the different impacts that you will get from different levels of global warming. Okay, so what's important here, I'm not going to be talking about anything, but is everything. Sorry, but we have the amount of extreme heat that we might experience for a 1.5 degree warming and then a 2 degree warming. So it's 14% of the world's population will experience extreme heat. Basically, when very hard to go outside with even 1.5 degree of warming, which is basically where we're headed. And if we allow ourselves to go for 2 degrees, which is still cooler than our current trajectory, it's 37% of the population. We can go through, there are other impacts that are listed there. I think I really want to highlight is that ecosystems will be massively affected. And a lot of them just won't be able to adapt in time for the speed of the warming that will happen. And also, as Julia's mentioned, food. A lot of our food sources will be affected here. So yields of wheat, our fisheries and things like that. Okay. As you know for that, there's one last thing, which is probably on the back here. Finally, I just want to say something about impacts. You have this picture here. So I've talked about general impacts. One of the things that we're interested in as Earth system scientists, thinking about how everything links together, is something called tipping points in the climate system. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but in fact any of them in detail. But there are lots of places here where a temperature change will set off different parts of the system that will move into a different state. You could think of it as like a ball has rolled down into a different dip and it can't get back out of it. It's gone down into a dip where we weren't before. So things like Arctic sea ice melting. If the Arctic sea ice melts, that might lead on to knock-on impacts on how the ocean circulation works in the Atlantic, which has massive implications for the weather that we have in Europe. The Amazon rainforest is highlighted there, as well as other ice sheets. You can ask me about this later, perhaps, if there's more time. Would you like to move on to your bit?
Yeah, we're doing good. So now we're going to move on to the issue of inequality. Thank you. And so you have a series of plots, and this was something that a lot of people had questions on last time we did this. So I just wanted to make it super clear that there's different ways of looking at inequality. So one of the problems with climate change is it's massively unfair, massively unequal, and I just want to go through some of the ways in which it's unequal. So one of the ways in which it's unequal is historic. Some countries have been emitting a lot more for a lot longer than others. And the problem with carbon dioxide, as we know, is it stays in the atmosphere for decades and decades. So the first one, the mustard-colored one, shows the percentage contribution over time of the top 20 countries. So the top 20 countries, in terms of who are the countries that have been contributing to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that shows that the United Kingdom. So you see the United States and China being pretty high up. And the United Kingdom comes in at number 5, despite being a rather small country by its population. That's because the United Kingdom was first off the block in industrializing and has been emitting for very long. Now, how does that change if we only look at 1 year? So in this case, it's the year 2017. So those are the sky blue ones. And now we're looking at the top 20 countries that emitted carbon dioxide in 2017. Who were they? How much did they emit? And you can see that China and the United States are still number 2 as they were before, but their order is flipped, right? You see India number 3, and you have to go all the way down to number 17 to see the United Kingdom. It looks rather small, but there are a lot of countries a lot smaller than that. There are about 200 countries total. So you have to imagine all the other 200 countries emitting a lot less. And now what we can do is we can look at yet another level of inequality, which are these 2 sort of darker blue plots. On the left-hand side, these are the same top 20 emitting countries, the same year, everything unchanged, but all we're doing is we're looking at what is the average emission of carbon dioxide per person in that country. Because some countries are huge, like China and the US and India, and some countries are small. So who are the per person large emitters? And you can see it's quite interesting because it changes totally, right? You have Saudi Arabia, Australia at the top, and then the United States, who are very big in lots of dimensions. And the United Kingdom has gone up to level number 13. In terms of the top 20 emitters, it's the number 13 in per capita emissions. And this plot shows, again, emissions per person. But this time what we've done is we've adjusted for trade. Because the United Kingdom imports a lot of stuff from China, from India, from all over the world, and also exports some stuff. But it turns out that the United Kingdom imports more than it exports. And so here what we've done is we found a way of calculating all the emissions associated with imports and adding them to the United Kingdom and to all the countries here, and removing all the emissions associated with exports. So that's why we call it trade-adjusted emissions. And you can see that the United Kingdom is now number 9, and indeed above China, which is lower down at number 13. So you see a lot of inequality here. Oh, and by the way, India is at the bottom of both rankings in terms of the top 20 countries. India has much lower emissions per person than the United Kingdom, and of course Saudi Arabia, the United States, etc. So I just want to talk about two other levels of inequality. So this is this green plot from a study from Oxfam, and what it's showing here very vividly is now what we're doing is we're taking the whole population of the world, and we're saying we're dividing it by rich people and poor people, no matter where they live. We're looking at their income. And what you can see is that the poorest 50%, which is the dark green bar here, are responsible for about 10% of the emissions, of carbon emissions worldwide. Whereas the richest 10% are responsible for 50%, roughly 49%, close enough, of the world's emissions. So you see a hugely unequal system. The lowest 50% in terms of poverty being responsible for 10%, the highest 10% being responsible for almost 50% of the total emissions. Very unequal in terms of income. And so that's another thing. Now, another inequality is in impacts, and Paul was talking about this. Impacts will not happen the same all over the world, and the same impact will not affect different types of people. If you're elderly or frail or ill or a child, you have different ways of coping with natural disasters, and so impacts will be felt very unequally. And we're not going to go into this in detail. This is just showing you one geographic example where you see what the world looks like with roughly 2.5 degrees of warming, which is better than what we're heading for right now. We're heading for 3+ by 2100. And what the color shows is it shows the numbers of days per year above a deadly threshold. So the numbers of days per year where populations in those colored areas would be experiencing temperatures so hot that you cannot go outside for any length of time without dying, because the temperature and heat are too hot for you to be able to cool yourself. And you can see that entire areas basically become uninhabitable. And this is very unequally distributed. Spoiler alert, these regions are not the regions that have emitted the most greenhouse gases historically. So you see very large inequality between emissions and impacts in terms of the locations. So that was the last type of inequality we wanted to discuss.
I can't see the last figure that you've got there. But so we've talked about what's happening, why it's happening, why we should care about it, and why it's unfair. Lastly, we want to talk about what we need to do about it. The bottom line is we need to get to zero emissions. Thank you very much. So this is basically what this plot is saying. If we want to have a better than evens chance of staying well below 2 degrees, at 1.5 degrees, then we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050. Now, there's many different ways that we can go about doing that, and you're going to explore some of these, I'm sure, over the coming weeks. But this obviously needs for a massive change in how we get our energy, and perhaps different types of technology and methods for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we talk about negative emissions. So for one way, really good way of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is from reforestation. So stopping the deforestation that's happening already and planting more forest. There are also a handful of technological ways out there, relying on various chemical methods or engineering methods for removing it out. They've been talked about, they've not really been proven at scale. So we need to really think about that as a risk for a future. If we're going to still be emitting lots of carbon dioxide from, say, air travel. We need to offset that somehow. What are the technologies? What are the ways we're going to go about doing that? And
finally, in terms of some of the things we need to do in order to bend this curve, we've been growing emissions and they're still growing. We're still in a phase of great acceleration and increase of emissions. And I just wanted to say something about the role of civic society, of us, in terms of, as citizens, in terms of turning this curve around, because it's something that a lot of decision makers, a lot of politicians, and a lot of business leaders have known about for a long time. The companies most responsible, we're only learning about this now in the last few years, some of the companies the most responsible for the products that cause these emissions worldwide knew where we were headed, knew that we'd be up here at 1 degree outside of the Holocene, outside of a safe space for agriculture. They knew that as long as I've been alive. They knew that since the late 1970s, as far as we know. And so they were refusing to tell people about it and refusing to change things. And our politicians also know about it, but they don't have what it takes somehow to really try to change things. So one of the things we have to think about is how do we change our societies? How do we provide other ways of making decisions? Because we see a lot of failure in both the political and business domains, where people have known about this stuff actually for quite a long time in some cases. And there's this idea of social tipping points. We have planetary tipping points over here, where something changes and then everything else changes. And one of the ideas is that maybe we can have society as a whole having tipping points and changing the way we do things, and basically rolling down this hill instead of rolling down some planetary catastrophe hills. But that's going to take a lot of engagement by a lot of people. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.